So, conservative commentator and Daily Wire host Andrew Klavan has made some stirs recently with his comments that women cannot fight with swords.
And so the lady who made the show, the showrunner, Lauren Schmidt, Hisrich, announced she was going to pay attention to the women. And immediately I was put off by the fact that there's a queen in this who fights like a man. And there's a couple of scenes where women fight with swords. And I just hate these scenes because no woman can fight with a sword. Zero women can fight with a sword. And what I mean by that is in a situation where you are fighting men who are used to fighting with swords, you are going to get killed if you were a woman fighting with a sword 100% of the time, right? Now, you can, a woman with a sword could kill somebody. A woman with a sword could kill somebody who doesn't know how to fight with a sword. But in a war situation where you are swinging this 5 to 10 pound sword again and again and again against much stronger men, they are going to kill you. So when you write a woman who fights with a sword, and this queen she's a man. They should have made the character a man. She's a man. She's gross, and she swaggers around, and she rips into the meat and tears it with her teeth, and curses people out. She's a man. So there was this feminist statement, and I just thought, please give me a break. And I don't.
So I've seen some other videos on this topic from channels such as Blood and Iron Martial Arts or Matt Easton of Scala Gladiatoria, and I largely agree with a lot of the things they've said in those videos, but I'd like to offer maybe some of my own more nuanced perspectives on some stuff in this video here, although I obviously have not watched everybody's video yet, and there are videos about this still being made even as we speak, so obviously I'm not going to know what everybody has said or will say, but I'll just do my best here. Also, there's bound to be some inevitable crossover when this many people are making this many videos about just one topic. One of the first myths I would like to expel here is that this has anything to do with leftist outrage or anti-conservative bias or that Andrew Klavan is being taken out of context or blah, 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 blah. To be fair, I have not seen everybody's video yet, as I mentioned earlier, so again, perhaps there are some videos that are clearly outrage videos, but most of what I've seen has been people who have knowledge of historical swordsmanship, and in many cases their channels are even largely dedicated to historical swordsmanship, explaining why Andrew Klavan was wrong. I've seen very little talk, just a little bit about like sexism or anything like that. I've seen very little stuff about that. It's mostly been pretty much down the line, Andrew Klavan was wrong, and here's why he was wrong. It's mostly been like that, and not only that, but they've provided the full context. Again, the few videos I've seen have done a very good job providing the full context of what Andrew said, which is frankly more than I've come to expect from the internet these days. So he's absolutely not being taken out of context. They're showing the full context, and I think doing a damn good job of making sure they show the full context, which I absolutely appreciate. And also, there's been very little talk from what I've seen about, oh, he's sexist, misogynist, bigot. No, it's mostly just been down the line. He's wrong. He's ridiculously wrong, and here's why he's wrong. And since these channels, especially, they specialize in historical combat, I think they have a right to talk about their area of expertise when somebody who is clearly in the wrong makes factually incorrect statements. It's not like this was a major news outlet who couldn't give a rat's ass about sword fighting, trying to blame a conservative because he didn't know about sword fighting. No, these were channels who know what they're talking about. This is their area of expertise, and they're simply calling out BS when they see it. Now that that's out of the way and we've made it clear this is not any sort of leftist outrage or anti-conservative bias, or at least not from what I've seen, we can get bit by bit what Andrew said. So the first bit that he said was basically that zero women can fight with a sword. That's obviously false. I think Andrew himself knows that's false, which is why he went on to explain later what he actually meant by that. Obviously, as others have pointed out, if you take just one cursory glance on YouTube, you'll find copious examples of female Olympic sport fencers, female kendo practitioners, females who participate in historical sword fighting and things like HEMA. It's obvious that females can, in fact, fight with swords. Now, you might argue, yeah, but that's competition sport, and competition sport does not in any way, shape, or form resemble real life or death fighting. And I would say, yeah, well, that's true to an extent, maybe. It's also true that if you were to give a Olympic sport fencer or a kendo practitioner or somebody who does HEMA, whatever, if you were to give them a sharp weapon that resembled what they're used to fencing with, you're still going to die. I mean, regardless of how realistic or not certain types of fencing competition are or aren't, if you give somebody who's really good at those things a sharp weapon that resembles what they're used to fencing with, you're still going to get skewered. I mean, that's just a fact. Now that you've been turned into a literal human shish kebab by the fencer you underestimated, you might be thinking to yourself, well, yeah, but technically Andrew didn't say that it was impossible for a woman to kill a man with a sword. He did specifically make a point to say that if a man didn't know what he was doing, then yeah, a woman probably could kill him with a sword. But it was more specifically on a battlefield situation where the man was trained how to use a sword that a woman would lose to him 100% of the time. Obviously, there are some problems with this, and I will try to go into some nuance here and maybe give him the benefit of the doubt in some cases, maybe not so much in others, but we'll go through this point by point and see how we feel about this. The first point I would like to address is I honestly don't really like how the premise of this is that we should just reject the first part of what Andrew said and just focus on the second part. Well, no, that would be like me saying you shouldn't eat your vegetables, and by that I specifically mean broccoli. Well, no, the first part is still wrong, and then when I tried to explain it, my explanation was also wrong. So when Andrew says 0 women can fight with swords, that's just wrong on its face. But then to give him credit, though, to give him the benefit of the doubt here, he did then try to go on and explain more specifically what he meant. And after his explanation, it was clear he was more talking about specifically a battlefield context. So while I'm willing to give him, I'm willing to acknowledge that he did try to explain more specifically what he meant, as you'll see throughout this video, the explanation, though, was still wrong, and it really didn't refute the first point that he said. So I can appreciate the fact that he tried to explain in more detail, but he was still very vague, very wrong, and it really didn't in any way, shape, or form make the first part of what he said any better or any more clear or any more correct, because it was just all wrong. The second point which I would like to address here is the inherent vagueness with which Andrew was speaking. Now, to be fair to him, I don't think this was necessarily intentional. I think he's simply outside of his area of expertise when it comes to this subject. You know, for example, is one person's weapon longer than the other one's? Is one person fighting injured? Is one person's skill level wildly disproportionate to the other one's? Because obviously that's going to make a huge difference. Whatever. So to be fair to Andrew, and also to make this conversation even worth having, I'm assuming we're talking about a man and a woman who are of relatively equal skill level, who are both using swords, because obviously this is about sword fighting. If you're using weapons other than swords, it's a whole different conversation entirely. So they're both using swords. The swords are relatively equal, and they are both at, pretty much peak fighting condition for their own personal best. So then obviously the next question would be, if this hypothetical man and hypothetical woman were both at relatively peak fighting condition for their own personal best, they were both using similar swords, and they were both at similar skill level, could the woman reliably beat the man? And the answer, as we're all fond of saying, is context. It depends. So let's say that she is wearing armor and he isn't, and they're only fighting with swords, nothing else. She'll beat him most of the times unless he's literally Superman. Otherwise, if she's wearing armor and he's not, and all they're fighting with the swords, she wins, I would say, nearly 100% of the time. Okay, so what about unarmored combat? Well, in unarmored combat, I would say that the man, again, if we're talking the average man and the average woman here, that are both of fighting capabilities, I would say that the man would have, yes, that strength advantage. Okay, that is true. And a lot of the videos I've seen have acknowledged this, that men in general, if we're talking about physical combat here, will have a strength advantage. And I will not deny that either. That is true. To give Andrew Klavan credit, it is true that I'm not sure about 100% of the time, obviously, we're not going to deal in absolutes here, but a lot of the time on a combat situation, the men will have strength advantages over the women, okay? But we're not talking about MMA here, where you have to basically either pin someone to the ground and like in wrestling, or knock them out if it's MMA or whatever. No, which even in an MMA situation, if a woman dodges an attack of a stronger man and gives a really powerful kick to his kidney or his face or something, who knows? She could still take him out. Who knows? But I understand, though, that in a situation where we're talking about hand-to-hand combat, it might be a little trickier to say that, a woman could win or not win if we're talking about averages, because on average the man would have the strength advantage, unless we're talking about a woman who is way stronger, way more fit, way more skilled. But then if that's the case, why would we be talking about this? She would obviously kick the man's ass in that situation. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, on average, an average woman of combat ability, an average man of combat ability with swords, okay? And with swords, if she voids one of his strong cuts, or she does a deflectional parry on one of his strong cuts and then does a riposte to his neck or whatever, All she has to do is land one good cut or one good thrust on a vital area, and he's done. Or she has to land a quick cut on one of his fingers, because she cuts his fingers off, he can't hold the sword. She lands a quick cut on his arm, and it's bad enough that he can't really fight with that arm anymore. He's screwed. So there's just so many ways in which a woman could use a sword to render a man incapable of continuing the fight, or just flat out kill him in bladed combat with no real armor being worn. So this notion that, you know, a woman would lose to a man 100% of the time is simply false. Yes, the man might have the advantage, but there's plenty of examples. Again, just look at YouTube. There's plenty of examples in various different disciplines of fencing and various different fencing sports of women beating men in sword fighting competitions. Well, if this was real life, all a woman would have to do is win that sword fight once, and the man would either be dead or rendered incapable of fighting. So, and I know you might say, well, yeah, everybody knows this. Yeah, but Andrew said specifically, women would lose to men 100% of the time. That's simply not true. He said 0 women can fight with swords. That's simply not true. You know, if Andrew just simply misspoke or was being taken out of context, it'd be clear that it was just one thing he didn't say. But no, he said what he said, and then he doubled down on it, and then he tripled down on it, and he kept going. So no, he clearly meant to say that in a battlefield context, in a combat situation, a woman would lose to a skilled man 100% of the time. And that's simply not true. Yes, the man in general, on average, would be fighting at an advantage, but there's still plenty of times when women beat men, and in an unarmored circumstance with sharp bladed weapons, just one of those times and she beats the man and it's game over. And finally, you would say, well, what if the man is wearing armor and the woman isn't? Well, then the woman loses 100% of the time. I mean, anything's possible, yes, but nearly 100% of the time she will lose. Because I don't care if you're a man, a woman, a demigod, I don't care. If you're fighting against an enemy knight in full plate armor, swords are useless. And again, we're talking about sword fighting here. We're not talking about using maces or warhammers, or no, we're talking about sword fighting. And if a woman is using a sword, I don't care if she's the most skilled swords person in the world. If she's using a sword, I don't care if she's the most skilled swords person in the world. She's the strongest person in the world. I don't give a shit. If she's facing an enemy knight in full plate armor, she will not be able to cut through his armor with her sword. I mean, okay, if she was like as strong as the Incredible Hulk, but if that's the case, we wouldn't even be talking about this, right? So again, we're assuming averages here. She's not going to be able to cut through his plate armor with a sword. Swords cannot cut through plate armor. Okay, if you're a man, a woman, or otherwise, you cannot cut through plate armor with a sword. The only way you can use a sword to defeat somebody in plate armor is by using it to thrust through the gaps in the armor. But guess what? Historically, knights were some of the most highly trained, highly skilled warriors on the battlefield. So that knight's not just going to let you waltz up and stab him through his plate armor. Usually what would happen is you'd have to wrestle a knight to the ground, subdue the knight, and then take out a dagger and stab the knight in one of the unprotected areas of his armor. That's just not easy to do, and also, if the woman's unarmored, she's just going to get cut up before she can even do that. If a man was unarmored, man, woman, I don't care what your gender or sex is, you're going to almost always die if you're not wearing armor and you're facing an enemy knight who is wearing armor and all you have is a sword. Sometimes you could use like the pommel or the crossguard to try to bash the helmet of the knight, but that, again, we're kind of getting into the weeds there. So, yeah. Now you might say, well, what if the woman is also wearing armor? I still say she loses most times, and the reason why I say this is because, again, the swords would be almost useless because they can't cut through armor anyway. So it would almost certainly come down to the man and the woman having to wrestle. Again, if they're both wearing full plate armor, they would have to wrestle each other to the ground, and until one of them subdues the other, maybe breaks one of the other person's limbs, and then uses a dagger to stab through the gaps in the armor, because that's usually what would happen if two knights got into it like that. And this is where we do get into the strength advantage of the man probably would usually overpower the woman. Again, we're talking averages here. Obviously, again, if a woman is stronger, more skilled, and more powerful than the man she's fighting, she will probably kick his ass most times. But that would defeat the purpose of the conversation because that's obvious. We're talking about averages here. So if on average, the man the woman is fighting here is stronger than her, and they're both wearing full plate armor, which means their swords are basically useless and they just have to wrestle each other to the ground, in that case, I have to admit the man probably would have enough of an advantage that in that case, I would say Andrew Klavan is correct there, that nearly 100% of the time the woman would lose in that certain context. But this is where we get into a crux of this here, is that Andrew did not specify armored versus unarmored, right? He did not specify what specific situation on a battlefield. He did not specify if he was just talking about that scene that he was reviewing in The Witcher, which is what created all this drama, or if he was talking more generally. So I think some people are trying to kind of retcon this and say like, oh, well, no, Andrew was only talking about in armor on a battlefield. No, he said in a battlefield situation, in a war situation. Well, not everybody on a battlefield was armored. As you got later on in history, more and more people became armored, but it was not uncommon on a battlefield for a lot of the soldiers to have little to no armor on. So I'm assuming he did not specify armored versus unarmored, and I also, based on the comments he made earlier about 0 women can fight with this, again, this is again why I think the comments he made in the beginning are important to still keep in mind here. He started this off by saying no woman can fight with a sword. 0 women can fight with swords. Maybe if a woman went up against a man who didn't know what he was doing, she could kill him with a sword. But in a war or a battlefield situation, a woman going up against a man who knew how to use a sword would lose 100% of the time. It's just, again, if he was just misspeaking once, or he meant to say, oh, in an armored situation, or this or that, he wouldn't have started out by saying, no woman can fight with a sword. 0 women can fight with swords. Maybe if the man, yada, yada, yada. It's very clear that he does not think women can sword fight. It has nothing to do with armored versus unarmored or what. No, he does not think women can beat men with swords. That is very clear by the fact that he doubled and tripled down on this point. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misspeak. He didn't get taken out of context. No, it is very clear that we are the ones who are speculating about armored versus unarmored, all that. He didn't do that. And I don't think it's because he's a sexist or a misogynist. I mean, if you think he is, that's your own. I mean, you can make that opinion on your own. I'm not trying to tell you what you have to think of Andrew Klavan as a person. I'm saying in this specific instance, I don't think this was sexism or misogyny or bigotry. I think he, honest to God, is just out of his realm of expertise here. He simply does not know what he's talking about when it comes to sword fighting, and I can prove that with the following statements. So the first way that I can prove he probably, again, I don't know the guy personally, but I can prove he probably has no clue what he's talking about, is that he's using The Witcher which is a fantasy show, as his baseline here for how the people were fighting. And it's like, I mean, why would you do that? Like, that would be like me watching a war movie and saying, oh, I watched a war movie, I now know exactly how it's like to be in combat. I mean, no. Also, he said that swords are 5 to 10 pounds. No, try like maybe 2 to 4 pounds on average. Some were lighter, some were heavier, to be fair, but it's like say 2 to 4 pounds on average. Okay, 5 to 10 pounds. That's not even remotely true. This leads me to believe that Andrew, and again, I'm conjecturing here. I don't know Andrew as a person. I'm conjecturing, but based on this leads me to believe that he likely, like a lot of other people who don't study historical sword fighting, had this misconception based on Hollywood stereotypes. The sword fighting is just like 2 hunking, really strong, Hulk-like guys swinging huge bars of iron and steel around at each other, like, you know, rah, rah, or whatever like that. It's like, no, that's not what sword fighting is at all. It just simply isn't. And I can't blame Andrew for not knowing that. If Andrew doesn't know that, he doesn't know that. And I can't blame him. I mean, no human being can know everything. So if Andrew Klavan does not have an expertise on historical sword fighting, that's not his fault. You know, he can't be expected to know everything. And, you know, if he honestly got duped, like a lot of people do, by Hollywood into thinking that sword fighting is something that it isn't, that's not his fault. But again, though, he did misspeak on something. I mean, he didn't misspeak. He did speak on a subject that he knew nothing about. He did make definitive comments based on something he knew nothing about. And I think it's right that YouTube channels that know what they're talking about are calling him out on this. Again, I don't think there's any political bias or political agenda behind it. I think it is just Andrew Klavan spoke about something he didn't know about, made some factually untrue statements, and he's being called out on it. And I think so far there's nothing wrong with that. Some other interesting points that have been brought up kind of pertain to, you know, what would a battlefield situation actually look like, you know, for a woman or a man, right, to be fighting on a battlefield. Well, it would likely have been more or less formation fighting for the most part. You'd be in a formation being ordered around by one or more different commanders, and it'd be more about your formation's cohesion, discipline, ability to fight as a unit, more so than the individual. And oftentimes, too, on a battlefield, swords were usually sidearms. Usually you were using things like pikes and halberds and spears and axes and stuff like that. That was usually your main weapon on a battlefield. especially that you would use in formation. Swords were usually more sidearms, only to be used in dire circumstances at the last minute, or if your primary weapon broke and you lost it and you couldn't find another one or whatever. So the amount of times that a woman or a man would be using a sword on a battlefield, I mean, it certainly happened, obviously, but it wasn't your main weapon, right? Your main weapon was like a pole arm or an axe or a spear or a pike or something like that usually. And I think that a woman, as well as any man, or as easily as any man, could be trained to use a weapon in a formation. I don't see any reason why a woman would have a harder time than a man being trained to use a spear or a pike or something in a formation. So actually on a battlefield, I don't know how often a woman would even be coming to sword contact with a man anyway, in a situation where it would just be her versus him with no external circumstances. You know, there wouldn't be arrows flying around that might kill one of them accidentally. Somebody else might not come up to them and stab them in the back or something. I mean, no, a situation on a battlefield where it's just a man and a woman, and they're just fighting in almost a duel-like fashion, you know, just each of them fighting each other with no other circumstances. That would just be so rare anyways. It most likely would be they'd be fighting with spears or pikes or something in formations, where it was more about formation and group cohesion and discipline and commander tactics, frankly, than it was about the individual fighting skill of a woman with a sword versus a man. So, and again, I don't expect Andrew Klavan to know all this necessarily. This is just general information. So on a battlefield situation, I find it very hard to believe that a woman and a man would even be coming to grips, you know, in a sword fight one-on-one with no other circumstances. Likely by the time, and somebody actually in one of the comment sections pointed this out to me, and I think they did a very good job of reminding me of this. In a battlefield situation, by the time it broke down to the point where you were individually fighting people with swords, likely your formations were broken by that point. People were running away, and as people were running away, the cavalry was just mopping you up anyway. So that's kind of what I feel about the whole battlefield formation thing, or the battlefield situation thing. And kind of one of the last things, too, that I'd like to talk about here, kind of wrapping up, thank you, by the way, if you've listened this long, is that this whole discussion is kind of crossing between two worlds here. And I think some stuff might honestly be getting lost in translation, because I think on one hand you have fans or people who are used to listening to the media outlet called the Daily Wire. The Daily Wire is a conservative media group. They're relatively popular. I think they're rapidly growing in popularity in like conservative media circles, and they some of the more prominent people on the Daily Wire network would be people like Andrew Klavan, who is obviously the gentleman in question here. Other people would be like Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles, and various others. And you know, I think a lot of people who listen to the Daily Wire and listen to these conservative hosts are understandably used to, you know, if a conservative host misspeaks or says something that could be taken the wrong way, or sometimes even if a conservative host says something completely benign, sometimes people not everybody on the left, obviously, but sometimes people on the more radical spectrum of the left political spectrum will deliberately take conservatives out of context, or deliberately try to bash conservatives for little to no reason, or will try to paint conservatives as these horrible, evil people, whatever. And so conservatives are constantly, right or wrong, are constantly feeling like they have to be on the back foot, like they have to defend themselves, like they have to, you know, almost kind of they're doing their own parrying and riposting and blocking, and, you know, kind of almost like they're in a sword fight for their lives, right? Trying to kind of constantly defend against attacks from the left. And, you know, so I understand why fans of the Daily Wire are maybe seeing these people calling out Andrew Klavan and just assuming this is another attack coming from the left, or just assuming this is another conservative being taken out of context deliberately to be bashed for no reason. But as we talked about earlier, though, I don't think at all that's what's happening here. Again, I don't see much of a political agenda behind these comments about Klavan. I don't see people calling, I mean, there's been a little bit of talk that he's sexist or misogynist, but not much. It's mostly just been about, he was wrong, here's why he's wrong, by people who know what they're talking about. So on one hand, you have people on the Daily Wire network, or who listen to the Daily Wire, who understandably are maybe feeling a little bit defensive because they're used to constantly having to defend the people the conservatives they listen to, maybe even themselves if they're also conservative. They're used to constantly having to defend themselves, their ideas, their beliefs, not only from legitimate critiques from the left, because obviously there are definitely legitimate critiques you can make of conservatism, but also from some of the more heinous, just outright stupid attacks that the left tries to put on them. On the other side, you have people who are HEMA enthusiasts, sword fighting enthusiasts, who frequent these sword fighting channels, who don't know who the hell Andrew Klavan is, don't know who might or might not know who Ben Shapiro is, he's more popular though, who might not have a clue what the Daily Wire is, and they just see this random kook talking about women can't fight with swords, and it's like, oh, give me a freaking break, and they just, you know, whatever, go off on him because they have no idea who he is. So I think that these two worlds are kind of crossing over, and when you're reading some of these comments in the comment sections, it's kind of hard sometimes because you don't know what background knowledge each person has. I seriously doubt that most Daily Wire fans have in-depth knowledge of historical swordsmanship, just like I doubt that most people who are watching these sword fighting channels have an in-depth knowledge of the Daily Wire, Andrew Klavan, Ben Shapiro, and all of them. So that would be something I think we should just keep in mind here, is the background of the various people who are commenting and the background of the various people who are trying to weigh in on this situation. Not everybody might have all the proper context. There's that word again. So again, thank you if you've listened this long. I'll just wrap up and summarize here that basically, you know, do I think Andrew Klavan, again, you can form your own opinion about the guy in general. I'm talking about just this very specific context here. Do I think he was trying to make some sort of sexist, misogynistic comment? Honestly, I don't. I think he's just completely out of his league with this one, has no freaking idea what he's talking about. It was trying to do what a lot of times they do on conservative networks, right or wrong. They try to make critiques of like modern third wave feminism. They're usually pretty good with first and second wave feminism, but in third wave feminism, they kind of make a lot of critiques of this stuff. It's what they do, like it or not. And I think he was trying to say that, you know, trying to portray what, because you heard a couple times when he said she might as well be a man, or her character might as well be a man, or she fought like a man, or whatever. I mean, and then he's saying like, this is obviously a modern feminist crap and give me a break. I mean, so it's like, okay, yeah, he's clearly trying to make a critique on feminism. So those critiques on feminism, you can argue those might be sexist, those might not be sexist. That's up to you if you think those critiques are sexist or not. Everybody's got their own opinion. That's fine. But the specific comments about sword fighting, though, I really don't think those were meant to be sexist. I just think he, honest to God, based on the fact that he thinks that swords weigh 5 to 10 pounds, and he's seriously using a fantasy show as a basis for what he thinks sword fighting is, I seriously just think the guy's out of his league here. I don't think he meant, in that specific, very specific context about the sword fighting, I don't think he meant to come across as sexist. I think he, honest to God, is just out of his league here. I think it's entirely appropriate, though, for people who do know what they're talking about with sword fighting, people who are relative experts on the subject, to call him out on it. I think that's entirely appropriate. I don't think this is any sort of political attack. I don't think this is the left trying to take conservatives out of context. No. Andrew Klavan said things that were factually incorrect. Relative experts in those fields are calling him out on it, and I think that's entirely appropriate. That's the appropriate, and that is the necessary dialogue we need to have with people. If we can't call people out when they're wrong on things without it always being considered a political statement, that's BS. Just like it's BS that Andrew Klavan thinks that a woman who can do a sword fight is a political statement on the part of the show. That's also BS. I think somebody pointed out, it's kind of funny, Andrew Klavan is okay with magic, he's okay with spells and everything else. In monsters, he's fine with all that, but the minute a woman can fight with a sword, he's like, oh no, that's not realistic. That irony is not lost on anybody, as it's been well pointed out. So yeah, I think it's as wrong to say that critiquing Andrew's comments on sword fighting is a political statement. I think that's as wrong as him saying that the sword fighting itself by women in the show was some sort of political feminist statement. No, I think that's all BS. None of this was supposed to be a political statement. The show showed a woman sword fighting. They have every right to do that. It's perfectly plausible that she can do that. It's, like I said, it's perfectly plausible that a woman can beat a man in a sword fight. If the man's wearing armor, it might be a little trickier and more implausible, but in unarmored combat, especially if she's wearing armor and he's not, it's entirely possible a woman can beat a man in a sword fight. I don't think the show is trying to be political or feminist about it at all. I don't think that people criticizing Andrew Klavan because he was wrong or trying to be, you know, are trying to make a political statement against him or anything like that. No, I think people are just coming at this from two totally different perspectives, and maybe some things are getting lost in translation, but hopefully this video can hope to kind of clear some of that stuff up. Again, thank you if you've watched this long, and have a nice day. And sorry, one final thing I forgot to mention here is that I've seen some videos make statements where they call Andrew out and say, hey Andrew, I'd like to see you face off against an Olympic level female fencer, or hey Andrew, come down to our club, we'll have some of our female fencers kick your ass or whatever. I think Andrew, just again, to give him the benefit of the doubt here, I think he understands that if he tried to pick up a sword and go against a skilled female fencer, he would get his sorry ass handed to him. I think he understands that. Even in his little statement, he said somewhere in there that a woman could kill a man with a sword if the man didn't know what he was doing. Unless Andrew has some secret fencing prowess that we don't know about, or he's secretly some amazing fencer or whatever, I think that he knows he would get his ass handed to him by a woman who knew what she was doing with a sword. I don't think that's necessarily what he was trying to say. I think he was trying to compare more a man of fighting skill and fighting level to a woman on a battlefield. I think that's more what he was trying to talk about. I think he's well aware that he would get his ass kicked by any woman who knew how to use a sword. And just one last thing here real quick. No, he was not only talking about those specific characters from The Witcher. No, he was not only talking about that specific scene from The Witcher. It was very obvious that he was using this to create very broad, generalized, absolute statements, such as 0 women can fight with a sword, or a woman against a man on a battlefield. If the man knows how to use a sword, the woman will lose 100% of the time. Yada, yada, yada. These were very broad, generalized, absolute statements. And he was wrong. Plain and simple, he was wrong. It's okay. We're all human. We're all wrong sometimes. This is not a criticism of Andrew. But people are also allowed to correct him when he's wrong, though. So, yeah. Sorry, I have to keep adding things on here at the end because I forgot to say them in the original video. But I can see how somebody might say something to the effect of, well, if you acknowledge that a man and a woman, if they are fighting in armored combat where they're both wearing armor, the man would win probably nearly 100% of the time, again, if we're assuming averages here. And so, therefore, if you admit that a man and a woman who are both wearing armor, the man would win almost every time, then you have kind of indirectly proved Andrew Klavan correct, because when Andrew Klavan specified that he was talking about battlefield combat, he's probably assuming that they're both wearing armor, and therefore, if you acknowledge that, you know, if they're both wearing armor, the man wins most times, you just kind of indirectly proved Andrew correct. I don't think so, because based on Andrew's comments about swords weighing 5 to 10 pounds and his just obvious lack of knowledge of sword fighting, I seriously don't think that Andrew has enough nuanced knowledge of what historical sword fighting actually looked like to even frankly know what the difference between armored and unarmored combat was. So I don't think Andrew was trying to make a unique critique about on a battlefield in armor, because knights would have to wrestle each other to the ground oftentimes before they could pull out a dagger, and that would require a lot more strength, and swords couldn't cut through plate armor. I don't think Andrew was going that far with it. I think literally he was just trying to say that in war, a man can beat a woman with a sword 100% of the time. Simple. It was a broad, generalized statement. He was not trying to make this nuanced critique about armored versus unarmored. No, that's what we're doing because it's an interesting discussion. I honestly don't think that Andrew Klavan gets a pass here just because it so happens that people might be wearing armor more often than not in the situation he was talking about. Or no, I think he was trying to make a generalized, broad statement that was simply incorrect. And this is where I will not give him the benefit of the doubt. Based on his other comments that clearly demonstrate his lack of knowledge on historical swordsmanship, I really don't think that he understands enough of the nuances about armored versus unarmored fighting that he was trying to make any sort of critique on that. I think he just generally thinks women cannot beat men with swords if the man knows what they're doing, which is obviously false. Also, some people have made videos talking about historical examples of women fighting with swords on battlefields and winning. That's all great. I just personally, I don't know about that stuff. I haven't researched specifically those, so I'm not going to comment on that, but that's entirely plausible, though, that, yeah, there are historical examples of women fighting on battlefields with swords and winning. That's great. You can go look up those YouTube channels and do your own research on that. That's fine. Hopefully, though, this is the last thing I have to add to this video, so again, thank you. And again, remember, not everybody on a battlefield was wearing armor, and he did not specify armored versus unarmored on a battlefield, and not everybody on a battlefield was wearing armor either. That's a big thing that he left out context-wise, so we don't know. So just remember, not everybody on a battlefield was armored. So, yeah. Okay, I promise that's the last thing. Thank you. Bye.